We have with us two renowned faculty members serving as panelists. First is Professor Jonathan Adler, the Johann Verheij Memorial Professor of Law and Director of the Coleman P. Burke Center for Environmental Law at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Welcome, Professor Adler.
Good to be here.
We also have with us Dr. Karen Beckwith, Flora Stone Mathers Professor in the Department of Political Science within Case Western Reserve University's College of Arts and Sciences. Welcome, Dr. Beckwith. Good to see you.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
I have two questions for each panelist, and then we will go to the questions submitted by reviewers when they registered. We received quite a number of questions. We will get to as many questions as we possibly can. Professor Beckwith, the word unprecedented was frequently used in 2020 for the pandemic, as well as for the presidential election. I am interested in hearing how you would surmise the presidential election and its aftermath.
First, let me say thank you to my Dean, Joy Ward, and also to the Alumni Association and all of those who are here today and also have posed questions for us. So thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about these issues. In regard to unprecedented, there are several points that I'd like to make. First of all, and this is for me the good news, the 2020 presidential and federal elections were, I would call, literally heroic elections in the context of a national pandemic, in the context of considerable political disruption, including leading up to the election. In the United States, we had record voter turnout. And so this, in the context of a pandemic, when persons had to vote during the pandemic, often in person, this struck me for all voters, regardless of vote choice, as phenomenal and heroic. Over 159 million Americans voted in this election. It's the largest total turnout of any election in U.S. history. And the percentage of turnout was also extraordinarily high. And if you'd like to see some data about that, I will provide it later, but let me just suffice to say that the turnout was reported at 66.7%. And for the United States, that's substantially high turnout. Again, the highest percentage turnout since 1900, 120 years ago. In addition, there were a record number of votes by mail and a record number of votes cast in early voting. So we have the entire U.S. electorate in a large proportion turning out to vote in the context of a national pandemic to make their voices heard, and I consider that heroic. The second thing that makes this election unprecedented is the extent to which we might have had a close call with the Electoral College. As everyone will know, the Electoral College is based on the results of elections within states for electors to the college, and the winner of the presidential election must win with a majority of votes in the Electoral College, and that's 270 votes. But we came very close, closer than we did in 2016, to the possibility not that the popular vote would be a mismatch with the electoral vote, but that the Electoral College might have produced a tie. In 3 states, if votes had been cast in a different direction, and only slightly more than 42,000 of those votes, the Electoral College result would have been a tie. And in the context of a tie in the Electoral College, the election of the president then moves to the House of Representatives. And in the House, each state has a single vote, regardless of the delegation size. And 27 states in the United States at that point, state delegations in the House were controlled by Republicans. So imagine a tie in the Electoral College, the presidential election thrown to the House, as is constitutional and required, and states in the House vote one by one. The outcome most likely being 27 votes for now former President Trump and 23 votes for the winner. Keep in mind, the District of Columbia has no votes in the House of Representatives. That would have resulted not only in a mismatch of the popular vote with the electoral vote, but it would have been a big surprise to most Americans who have not seen this. None of us have seen this and are probably highly unaware of this. And so the likelihood of a popular majority for the loser who was the winner confirmed by the House of Representatives by only a vote of 27 states, would be just extraordinary and would raise serious problems about democratic legitimacy and electoral legitimacy. And the third unprecedented point that I will make here has to do with the sitting president's attempt to interfere with and to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, and which resulted in subsequent ongoing criminal investigations of the former president. These, again, are unprecedented. And let me just very quickly remind you of the steps that President Trump was taking both before the election in terms of what political scientists refer to as match fixing, about which I'll have more to say later, but in regard to the step that he had been making since the election. Before the election, he had been making changes in the U.S. Postal Service in the election year in advance of the election. He made multiple public claims about the illegitimacy of voting by mail, attempting to minimize the turnout that was going to happen by mail and force people to vote or encourage people to vote instead in public. He supported a variety of voter suppression efforts. He made, again, multiple public claims about the illegitimacy of the election itself in advance of the election and its aftermath. And then finally, let me add just a fourth point. This is not unprecedented, but it is a powerful force right now in U.S. politics, and that is the extent to which political and ideological polarization is mapped to political parties, is taking place in Congress, and then is pulling public opinion as well. And so we have within the Congress substantial polarization, both ideologically and on vote choice, and we also have it reflected in the mass public. So I will leave you with those 4 points for now and give Professor Adler a chance to talk.
Well, thank you, Dr. Beckwith. I really appreciate your very interesting answer. Professor Adler, your work was cited in the U.S. House of Representatives article of impeachment. Can you provide us more information on what work was cited, how it was used, and how did you learn it was included?
Sure. So first, it's a pleasure to be here today. I hope everyone's keeping warm and safe on a snowy day like this. So I contribute to a legal blog called The Bollock Conspiracy. And one of the things we often do on that blog is try and break down legal issues to make them understandable to an educated but non-lawyer audience. And I did a bunch of posts trying to summarize what we understand about the history of impeachment, standards for impeachment, whether or not you can engage in what's referred to as a late impeachment, that is an impeachment after the official in question has left office. And I did some posts looking at what the standards for impeachment are and addressing some of the arguments that are being made, the constitutional arguments that were being made about whether or not Donald Trump could be impeached and convicted for the conduct that he committed. And one post in particular discussed the understanding of what constitutes an impeachable offense, treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors, discussing how the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors was not understood and has never been understood as merely referring to actual criminal offenses, but rather was understood to encompass a range of abuses of power that public officials are capable of engaging in or committing, and that this was the understanding prior to the adoption of the Constitution, and it was certainly the understanding that those who drafted the Constitution and included an impeachment power understood that they were including. And the idea is that a president is given all sorts of powers, things like the power to pardon, the power to control the military, and the like, and that the misuse of those powers in ways that are incompatible with a president's oath of office are the sorts of things for which a president can be impeached, removed, and barred from holding future office. I also specifically addressed the claim that had been advanced that if the president's speech, his encouragement of his supporters to come to the Capitol on January 6th to fight for his electoral votes and so on, if that speech were protected by the First Amendment if uttered by a private citizen, whether or not that could or should preclude a member of Congress or a senator from voting to impeach or convict on that basis. And I explained why because of this understanding about what the nature of high crimes and misdemeanors are, that even if one concluded that his speech were not incitement for First Amendment purposes and was thus First Amendment protected, that would not and should not bar a member of the House from voting to impeach or a member of the Senate from voting to convict, because again, the standard is different. There's all sorts of conduct for which we might conclude that if any of us engaged in, and speech that if any of us engaged in would be protected by the First Amendment as against, say, criminal prosecution or a civil tort suit, but that would nonetheless be incompatible with a president's oath of office and obligation to see that the Constitution is upheld and that the laws of the country are faithfully executed. And that point in particular was cited in the impeachment report by the House and the impeachment referral. But I had no idea this was going to be cited. Just the last point is I learned when someone, I think probably on Twitter, pointed out to me that I was being quoted and being cited, which was kind of fun. It was an argument that I was making is one that I think is broadly accepted by constitutional law professors who've looked at this question. And it's one that certainly a majority of both the House and Senate accepted, even if not the 2/3 majority that would have been required for conviction.
Thank you, Professor Adler. Now I have a question for both of you. What are your thoughts about how the country moves forward with a specific regard to each major political party? What is next for them? I'll let Professor Adler go ahead with that first.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question, and I certainly think that Dr. Beckwith will have a lot to say on this. But I think one thing that's worth noting with regard to both political parties is the polarization that Dr. Beckwith already pointed to, is the fact that both parties are struggling internally over their direction. And in both parties, there's a portion of the base, the portion of the party that appears to be most politically active, most engaged on social media, most likely to turn out in primaries, that is further from the center of American politics than perhaps the median voter of that party. And that this is going to create a challenge for both parties. In the Republican Party, it's the diehard folks that want to continue to support Trump, that want to continue to fight those battles, believe that Trump did nothing wrong, that everything was fake news and so on. And in the Democratic Party, I think you see that in some of the more progressive elements of the party. And I think you see it in just last point in the election results that we've seen. We see why this is a challenge for both parties. So while Joe Biden won overwhelmingly in the popular vote in the November election, the down ballot results for Democratic candidates were not what we might have expected, and suggest that a significant portion of voters were, while voting against Donald Trump, were perhaps somewhat uncomfortable with what they saw as the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But by the same token, the special election in Georgia suggests that there is a significant portion of voters who might normally be expected to vote in favor of Republican candidates, say for the Senate, but were uncomfortable with Donald Trump and may have seen that election as a referendum on Donald Trump's conduct and whether or not that should be what the Republican Party stands for. So I think both parties face significant challenges, and it's probably a hard time to be someone close to the middle.
Thank you. Very interesting. Dr. Beckwith, what are your thoughts on what is next for the political parties?
Well, the first thing I want to say about the political parties is the United States is the only wealthy democracy, literally the only industrialized democracy, that has such a small number of competitive parties. And so when we think about the U.S. two-party system, there are only two parties that can effectively compete for office at the national level, and in most cases at the state and local level as well. So we start with the smallest number of competitive political parties for a nation of our size and our power. Secondly, both parties have been struggling across time, and struggling may be too strong a word, but grappling with the demographic changes in the United States. So we know that the race and ethnic balance in the United States is shifting, and that shift is not innocent, so to speak, of partisanship. So as the percentage of voters who identify themselves as Hispanic, Latino, Latina increase, those voters also are identifying themselves primarily as Democrats, and they're also voting primarily at the national level, at least, for Democratic Party candidates. This is an advantage for the Democrats, and it is a serious problem for the Republicans. Similarly, although the numbers are much smaller, Asian American voters are also increasing in their proportion, the proportion that they account for in the national electorate. And they also, by about a 2/3 majority, favor Democratic Party candidates and identify with the Democratic Party. So here are two growing ethnic groups that, and I use that term in a large comprehensive way. We know that these groups, even internally, are highly diverse. But nonetheless, for self-identification purposes, it is the case that these groups are growing within the electorate in terms of proportion, and they tend to behave and identify disproportionately with the Democratic Party. This is a challenge for the Republican Party. So both parties are struggling with this, however, and it's been interesting to see the little struggle in regard to Latinos and Latinas in even the most recent election. The additional thing that I want to say about this is that appears to be right now a more serious problem for the Republican Party than it is for the Democratic Party. But I want to say a few things about that to provide a little context here. The first is the Democratic Party has won. This is not a big win, but it's an important win. It has won the presidency. It has won a majority in the Senate. And actually, to be technically correct, only 48 of the senators identify as Democrats, but the two independents from Maine and Vermont sit with the Democratic caucus. And so that gives the Democrats 50 Senate seats within the Senate. And because the vice president is a Democrat, she sits as the president of the Senate and can cast a tie-breaking vote. And in addition, the Democrats lost some of their majority, but they still hold the majority in the House. And right now it appears, at least to me, that the Democratic Party is holding together within the Congress and within the presidency. They have won, so to speak. It's not a massive win, and the margins are small. But the party seems to have consolidated whatever struggles in the 2008 primary elections, for the presidency, whatever the struggles in the 2016 primary elections. Nonetheless, it is the case that even those in the progressive wing of the party seem to have come around to recognizing that if they want to get things done, they have to get it done as a solid party. This is not yet the case for the Republican Party, and they will be sorting out their losses. Let me also say the Republican Party has fewer registered voters nationwide than the Democratic Party, and it has fewer party identifiers than does the Democratic Party. Again, these differences are not huge, but this is the challenge for the Republican Party moving forward. A party where 52% of their identifiers, as reported by the Pew Foundation, believe that the recent presidential election was dishonest and that the results are incorrect, that in fact the former President Trump did win that election. That's going to be a big challenge for the party moving forward. Let me say one more thing about this. In 2012, the Republican Party lost the presidential election. Mitt Romney did not become our president. And as a result, the Republican National Committee commissioned a study called the Growth and Opportunity Project, which was a report to analyze that loss and figure out where the party should move forward. It had some really interesting things to say, and I thought it was a fairly good strategic plan, including targeting Latinos and Latinas, young people, and women for inclusion in the party. And the Republican presidential primary candidate debate that took place in August 2015 resulted in that whole project just being thrown out. It was literally blown up when Donald Trump, the candidate, had a variety of things to say about Mexicans and others. And so I'll be interested to see how the Republican Party moves forward if there is a similar coming to terms. And we can see also some of the public statements that a variety of Republican Party elites have made, including most recently, for example, Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina.
Thank you very much. Now I'm excited to move to our viewer questions. Dr. Beckwith, how about you take the first one? What institutional changes to the political system need to occur to protect further erosion of the democratic system of government?
So I just want to say thanks for these very simple, easily answered questions from those who submitted. So the first thing I want to say about this is that changing the rules of the game, changing institutional and structural arrangements is not sufficient to addressing what we need in regard to confirming and strengthening democracy in the United States. We can change lots of rules of the game, but if there aren't changes in civil society, commitments to democratic procedures, commitments to compromise and to toleration of outcomes, one of the key defining factors of democracy is that the losers accept the loss and they move forward, and the winners do not employ the tools, the power and the tools of government to oppress and eliminate their opponents for the future. So changes in civil society will definitely be necessary. In terms of structural changes, there are so many. I can hardly list them all, and some are better than others. The first I would say is there has to be some change made to the Electoral College. And there's a question, I think, that may be coming up subsequently that asks about the failure of the Democrats to win presidential elections, even as they have won the popular vote, for example. And so the Electoral College has within it some real dangers for us, and then some outcomes that appear to be undermining democratic legitimacy. In this regard, I mean, democratic legitimacy with a small d. So making changes in regard to the Electoral College, moving to a national popular vote or some other arrangement is probably crucial. Secondly, the Democrats have introduced into the House the Fair Representation Act. This is an act that would move House elections. It would reconfigure House district elections to make them multi-member districts. It would include a provision for ranked choice voting, which is currently used in Maine for congressional seats. And it would also do a variety of other things, including establishing independent redistricting commissions. So the Fair Representation Act is a means of getting around partisan gerrymandering. It's also a means of changing the electoral system so that persons are not elected to Congress, and primarily the House, where they have less support for the elected candidate, then there is opposition to that candidate from those who voted against that person. So just very quickly, our House districts currently are single-member plurality districts. This means there's only one seat to be won. Whoever wins it wins with the most votes, regardless how small that margin might be. So in a three-way race, a person could win a House seat with 34% of the vote, for example. That means that 66% of the people in the district didn't want that person and wanted someone else. So ranked choice voting would help solve some of that as well and make it easier for people to vote sincerely in the first instance and then rank their second choice preference and maybe their third choice preference, et cetera. So the Fair Representation Act, I think, is a really good way to go. There's also a For the People Act, which has been introduced in the House, and this has to do with access to voting and voting rights. Those are changes I think are really good ones. Now, there's some big changes that people have also proposed. These include changing our political system to a proportional representation system. Another has to do with changing the number of House districts, which can be done by legislation. We have currently 435 House districts. We could change that to make it a little more proportional to population and a little more egalitarian across all of the districts, and perhaps provide smaller districts that might be more responsive to their constituents and where the elected official would be more responsive to constituents. I'll just say one thing about that. That strikes me as a proposal that will increase the number of seats in the House, and what happens thereafter, I think, is really unknown. The only thing certain is that increasing the number of seats in the House will increase the number of seats in the House. Whether or not it provides more cooperation or better representation, I think is a really open question. There are a variety of changes that have to do with absentee ballots. I just want to say one really, really brief one, which is in Ohio, our Secretary of State and all of the boards of elections start counting votes before the election. So votes that come in by absentee ballot or by early voting, they start getting counted before the final election day. And this allows our state and other states like it to produce an outcome more quickly, to check on it more quickly, and to announce the results quickly. The state of Pennsylvania is precluded from doing this. They are not allowed to count any votes until election day, which means that there can be information about in-person voting that is easily counted and reported, and then additional votes that come in that appear to change the election outcome. This may be a little difficult for people to understand, so I would encourage states to do just that simple change. Start counting at some point once all the mail ballots begin coming in. Gives them a head start on reporting. There are proposals to move to a parliamentary system. John Kerry at Dartmouth University, Dartmouth College has recently cited Juan Linz's work on the tyrannical capacity of presidential systems, which is what we have. I think a move to a parliamentary system is not likely to happen. So there are lots and lots of suggestions.
Thank you, Professor Beckwith, for very thorough and in-depth and critical points that you raised. I really appreciate that. This next question is for you, Professor Adler. In recent weeks, the Supreme Court ruled on California's ban on indoor worship with an opinion. Justice Barrett's first, that many say noted the court's conservative majority is fractured. Should we see this as unique to pandemic-related suits or indicative of the notion the majority isn't as united as some may think?
Well, I think it's the latter, and I don't think this is new. If we look at the performance of Supreme Court justices over the last 15 years, we've actually seen quite a few fractures among the conservatives on the court. And in fact, these fractures and divisions have been far more visible on what we might characterize as the right side of the court among those justices who were nominated and appointed by Republican presidents than among those who were nominated and appointed by Democratic presidents. If we look at a lot of the really big high-profile cases of the last 15 years, whether we're talking about Burke versus Hodges that held that same-sex marriage had to be provided on the same basis or equally with opposite-sex marriage, or the Bostock case from a year ago, which held that Title VII, the prohibition in Title VII on discrimination on the basis of sex encompasses discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and transgender status, the Affordable Care Act decisions, and so on. We actually see divisions among the conservative justices in all of those cases, sometimes divisions on outcomes, but also divisions on methodology and the approach. In the Obergefell versus Hodges case, for example, every Republican member of the court wrote an opinion in that case. No Democratic member of the court wrote an opinion in that case. The majority was written by Justice Kennedy, and then each of the other Republican appointed justices wrote a separate dissent, and there were important and meaningful differences in those cases. This is something that we've seen over the last 15 years. I think this is something we will continue to see, and it's something that, based on history, we should expect to see. So just to take one example, during the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt nominated a supermajority of the then sitting justices. And they were nominated in part based on what President Roosevelt thought they would do with regard to the questions that President Roosevelt was most concerned with. That was the constitutionality of various New Deal measures and the scope of the federal government's power. But justices serve for life or so long as they wish, typically, or so long as they engage in good behavior. And very quickly, the sorts of cases and issues that were being presented to the Supreme Court were different than the sorts of questions and cases that the nominating president had in mind when selecting those justices. And so the same justices that voted as a block in the New Deal federal power cases would splinter when the questions before the court were questions related to civil rights, questions related to criminal procedure and the rights of those accused and the like. And I think similarly, we see that justices that were nominated with a concern about particular sorts of issues depart from those issues or depart from voting as a block when the questions are posed differently. And on the current court, this is the last point I'll make, we see some very significant distinctions, both based on methodology, the extent to which different conservative justices believe that the original public meaning of the Constitution should control outcomes, whether or not textualism is the proper basis for interpreting federal statutes. We see differences with regard to how much sway stare decisis or existing precedent should have. Chief Justice Roberts in particular seems very concerned about precedent and the stability it creates. Justices Thomas and Gorsuch do not seem particularly concerned with the role of precedent in maintaining stability within the legal system. We also see differences on the nature of relief that should be provided in cases, as well as what degree of deference should or should not be provided to government officials that are basing decisions based on, say, public health expertise and the like. So I think the case that the questioner mentioned is emblematic of these divisions, but I don't think these divisions are new. And I suspect we will see them emerge in a wide variety of cases in the years ahead.
Thank you. Another question from our viewers for Professor Beckwith. Why are Republicans so much better at messaging than Democrats? How do Republicans manage to elect presidents with fewer votes than Democrats? And what can Democrats do about this?
So these are really different questions and really interesting.
They are. They're great questions for our viewers. I'm really pleased of their participation in this.
I am too. This is so interesting to me. So the first thing I want to say is that I wouldn't say that the Republicans are better at messaging, but the Republican Party has an advantage in messaging insofar as their messages are very specific and homogeneous and not necessarily issue specific. So when we think about the work by Grossman and Hopkins and in their book Asymmetric Politics, they argue that there are major differences between the two parties in terms of the mobilizing foundations that they provide. For the Republican Party, the message is less issue specific than it is ideological and conservative. And so the messages are very clear about cultural conservatism, about libertarian and neoliberal versions of laissez-faire economics, and a commitment to staunch, what Grossman and Hopkins refer to as staunch anti-communism. So these are not issue specific, and these are not even necessarily group directed, although the Republican Party certainly has put together a coalition of a variety of different groups. But nonetheless, the message, which is compelling to the party's supporters, is uniform, it's overarching, and it's fundamental. And so that makes the message very, very easy and very, very clear in comparison to what the Democrats do. And the Democratic Party is put together a little differently. It's more complicated, and it has multiple messages because it's organized around primary groups that support the Democratic Party and that offer a panoply of issue-specific legislative initiatives that will be helpful to those specific constituencies. And so the message is not unified and comprehensive and overarching in the way that the message is for the Republican Party. So that's an advantage for the Republican Party. The Democrats have to speak to a wide range of different groups and have to be specific about what they might offer. I will note that the 2020 Republican National Convention had no party platform. There was not the kind of panoply of issues that party platforms usually offer. Now, the second part of that question had to do why Democrats always lose the elections, which is not, I'm overstating here and I'm being a little facetious, but it is the case that the Democratic Party's presidential candidates have won the popular vote in 5 of the last elections. They won it in 2000, 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2020. But of those 5 elections, they actually managed, not only in winning the popular vote, in 3 of those, they managed only to win the presidency. So the problem of the popular vote mismatch with the Electoral College vote is a serious question, and it's not just a serious question for the poor Democratic presidential candidates who, are thinking won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote. And let me just add a little footnote here: be sure you campaign in Ohio. Be sure you campaign in Ohio. I would say to everyone. The answer to this is not something that the Democrats can address in and of themselves. It's an Electoral College issue. And that's something that I think the Democrats both Democrats and Republicans need to attend to, because there are serious small d democratic issues in regard to system legitimacy and willingness to comply with election outcome.
Thank you for providing real insight on that question. I really appreciate that. Professor Adler, due to fictional assertions of widespread fraud, there may be backlash of increased voter suppression. What are the concrete plans to prevent vote suppression in the 2022 election cycle?
There's a bunch there, and let me say a few things about it. First of all, allegations of vote fraud, unfortunately, aren't new. Allegations of voter suppression aren't new. I think in the 21st century, claims of both are wildly overstated. Over the last 20 years, our elections have generally become more reliable, and it has become easier to vote than at any point in our nation's history. The reality is while there are sometimes instances of elections that are within the margin of error, or where our electoral election systems aren't particularly good at ensuring that the precise number of votes cast. This election, there was a congressional race in New York where this was the case, and another one in Iowa, both of which were so close they were effectively in the margin of error. The reality is that in the vast majority of instances, neither fraud nor voter suppression, properly understood, is controlling the outcome. I think there is a broader debate that that we are going to be having, just like we had in the wake of the 2000 election, about what sorts of election systems we want and how our elections should be administered. And there are two things that are worth noting there. One is that we have to have rules to determine what is or is not a legal vote, when you can vote, and what that process is. I think it's unhelpful sometimes to characterize these various differences in terms of what's suppression or what's fraudulent and the like. So, for example, should we have a single election day? Should we have early voting? If we have early voting, how long should that period be? I think we would all agree that it shouldn't be vote any time in the next 4 years for the next president. But I think there's also a consensus that simply or only allowing the possibility of in-person voting on that one Tuesday in November is also an unreasonable and improper rule. And there are debates we're going to have about what those rules should be, as well as who makes those rules. Should they be made by the legislature? Should they be made by election administrators, whether that's under the control of an elected statewide Secretary of State like we have in Ohio, or other election administrative officials, or whether they can and should be made by courts. And that last part is certainly quite controversial. The other thing that makes these debates so rough, or so sharp, I guess I should say, is that we know so much about election behavior and voting behavior, is that no one is making these choices purely in the abstract on the basis of what would be the fairest approach. We all know that if you make certain changes, you allow early voting on 2 Saturdays as opposed to 1. You allow election polls to stay open until 10 o'clock as opposed to 7. We all know on the margin who benefits or loses from those changes. And since ultimately these choices are made typically by folks that are themselves elected or themselves affiliated with a party, we're having what is effectively a partisan debate on how do we shift the rules on the margin in a way to slightly advantage our side or the other side. And that's a problem, because ideally we would be able to sit down and have a discussion about, okay, what sorts of rules maximize both access consistent with elections being essentially an assessment of popular judgment at a particular point in time. And there's a balance there to be struck, but we have a hard time striking that balance because we know what the partisan implications of shifting the balance slightly in one direction are or another. All that said, just as in the wake of the 2000 election, there was a lot of debate, discussion, and ultimately improvement in the way election systems were conducted in many states. I expect that we will see something like that here, and I suspect there in particular will be a lot more discussion and debate, both about the parameters of voting by mail, but also about how you have voting by mail in a way where the votes can be counted and tabulated in a way that reinforces voter confidence as opposed to undermine it. So hopefully that will mean more states doing things like we do in Ohio and fewer states doing it like they did in Pennsylvania.
Thanks very much. Really interesting here about the balance and all of the factors that go into that. Appreciate that. I now have questions I would like to pose to both of you. How will the current administration deal with current polarization in the country and the lack of political bipartisanship? And what are universities doing, or should they be doing, in this regard? And I'll go ahead and let Professor Beckwith begin the answer to that.
Thank you for this very, very good question. So let me say first how the new administration is defining bipartisan. I've been very interested in watching Jen Psaki, who is the president's press secretary, talk about working in a bipartisan way. When she talks about this, she talks not about bipartisanship in the Congress, but bipartisanship in the American public. And that's a very interesting way to talk about bipartisanship. And it's also a politically useful way to talk about it, because thus far, at least, the major initiatives that President Biden has undertaken have the support of a majority of the American people, regardless of political party. And so the current administration has some support in regard to its current policy initiatives. And so what might be evident in still polarization in Congress in terms of policy preferences, and that's going to be a big fight there, regardless of party identification, it's possible that identifiers of both major parties and also independents will continue to reflect, as they are in the data, support for many of these issues. Now, the Pew Foundation said last month that the two most important issues that the current administration has to address are the economy and the pandemic, in that order. And those are ones that are identified, again, regardless of party identification. So that's something that the current administration seems to be handling well. The two major issues are not necessarily partisan issues, and they're big, crucial issues. And then the administration is speaking primarily to everyone, not just to Congress. And that, of course, is a useful political tool. If you can manage public opinion, you can bring pressure on those in Congress who are not willing to support your policy initiatives. There are several things that I think universities can do, and some may be doing some of these things. Now, keep in mind, I've got a particular interest in this regard, but I think it would be useful to have to require students, as part of our general education requirement at our university, to take a course in U.S. politics. And I say this from a long, decades-long teaching U.S. politics, especially the intro course, where I often say to my students in the first several weeks of class, this may be the last time in your life, maybe the only time in your life, where multiple times a week, for more than 1 hour, you get to sit with people who are learning what you're learning about the U.S. political system, and you get to talk face to face about these issues. And this is not a chosen group of people. These are not just your friendship network or just your family network. This is a diverse group of people. That is a huge advantage for people understanding not just the U.S. political system, but understanding democracy, democratic theory, and democratic practice, and identifying what are the democratic strengths of the United States, what are the current democratic dangers, and also what are the current democratic deficits that we might be working to overcome. So that's the first thing I would say. I would also say anything that facilitates face-to-face discussion. There's a lot of evidence from political psychologists, for example, that show that the best way to come to conclusions and also to change people's minds is not by showing them a lot of facts, even though I've been sharing a lot of facts with you today, but to interacting with them face-to-face and talking face-to-face about personal experiences. In fact, some political psychologists have some substantial evidence that when confronted with empirical evidence that contradicts one's own political position, one is more likely to confirm one's original position and lock into that position than to change one's mind. So universities can facilitate face-to-face discussions outside of class, and I would say that should encourage that should include the most highly ranking university officials, maybe even members of the board of trustees, students and staff and faculty. And finally, I would urge all universities, this is my most recent push, so to speak, to recognize that good science requires good government. So this is not just about democracy and politics. This is also about what we need to achieve. And our university is renowned for its emphasis and success in the STEM disciplines. But those disciplines cannot produce what they need to produce if we don't have good democratic government. And that's something that I hope we recognize and say as often as we can.
Thank you. Really appreciate your point about the science side as well. Professor Adler, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll just say a very little bit. First, I agree with a lot of what Dr. Beckwith just said. As a law professor teaching, law students, it would certainly be much easier in many of my classes if the students coming in had relatively recent experience studying U.S. politics. I sometimes have students that haven't thought about U.S. history or U.S. politics since, say, a 10th grade U.S. history class. And I think that certainly makes it more challenging to teach the legislative process, statutory interpretation, constitutional law, and so on. So I agree with a lot of that. And I think the point that Dr. Beckwith made about the importance of face-to-face dialogue is particularly important. Universities have a role in helping educate and train people to be citizens in a society in which we have responsibilities as citizens. And I think a very important thing that universities can do, and that I'm not convinced that all universities do that well, is to model constructive engagement and dialogue across what are often very stark ideological, political differences across a wide range of issues. I think universities can do a lot more to model what it means to engage in discussions where, with goodwill and good faith, we try and wrestle through what are very hard issues about which we may have very strong disagreements. Similarly, I think, when universities talk about the importance of things like critical thinking, one aspect that I think universities could emphasize more is the role that charitable interpretation also plays in critical thinking. When we are trying to understand the point or the argument that someone else is making that is different than our own, can we try and not, rather than trying to immediately pick it apart and assume that the person making that argument must necessarily be operating in bad faith, but can we try and figure out what would be the most charitable and persuasive position that other person may be having? That sort of empathetic engagement is something that I'm partial as a law professor, because good advocacy often requires understanding the internal perspective of one's opponent. What's the strongest argument the person on the other side is going to be able to make against your own? I think that's actually a skill that's very useful for citizens, to be able to be engaged in constructive dialogue about the challenging issues that face our country. And I think universities really are uniquely positioned to help play a role in that, and certainly think universities can and should try and do more of it.
Thank you very much. And now I'm moving to the final question. And this is for both of you, and I'll have Professor Beckwith start and then Professor Adler and his comments to this question. Does the former president bear responsibility for the actions on January 6th? Go ahead, Professor Beckwith.
This is an easy answer. Yes, he does. And I can elaborate a little, but I don't think I really need to. Members of his own party have been very clear, impeachment aside, that he bears, to quote the minority leader in the Senate, moral and practical responsibility for what happened. I had said I'd talk a little bit about match fixing. Match fixing is setting the terms of and conditions for the outcome before the outcome actually happens. It's setting the outcome of the game. It's conditioning and priming for one kind of outcome in a game or a contest before the contest even starts. And the minority, Mitch McConnell, the minority leader now in the Senate, laid that out very, very clearly in his recent remarks. So yes, the former president bears complete responsibility for that. I'll just make a final comment. It's horrific to see a mob of persons chanting that they are going to murder our vice president when the president of his own party sits by and does nothing for hours, and in fact encourages it. Of course, former President Trump bears complete responsibility. He's not the only person who bears responsibility, but the responsibility is laid at his feet. And I think that's uncontestable.
Thank you. Professor Adler?
Yeah, I would say, I would put it this way. I think that the president bears responsibility for his conduct, and the conduct that he engaged in is incompatible with the oath of office that he took and his responsibilities as president of the United States. And let me just draw a historical comparison that may be useful for those of us here in Ohio. Some folks may remember the 2004 presidential election, and there were all sorts of allegations and claims made about what was occurring in Ohio. And had John Kerry won Ohio's electoral votes, he would have had a 261 to 268, 271 to 269 majority in the Electoral College. He would have won the Electoral College just by flipping Ohio, even though he did not win the popular vote. And there were claims about election fixing and fraud that were very similar to a lot of the claims we heard this past year. Just substitute Diebold for Dominion voting systems, and you get an idea of the claims that were made. But what was really interesting, right, is that even though a few members of Congress wanted to challenge those Ohio's electoral votes in the House of Representatives, and 31 voted in favor of that, joined by one senator, it never went anywhere because John Kerry understood that one of the obligations of being a political leader is recognizing the obligation of leadership and the obligation to not cynically take advantage of claims that one knows are not true, one knows are not substantiated, and that one knows are cancerous to the overall body politic. And as a consequence, the allegations about what occurred in Ohio never went anywhere, never caught fire, never were allowed to metastasize within our political system and undermined the faith in our overall electoral system and our ability to move forward as a democratic republic. That stands in stark contrast to the behavior of Donald Trump, both before, during, and after the election. He saw an opportunity to take advantage of things that were not true, of things that played upon people's fears about our electoral system, and that had very poisonous and destructive consequences. And I think it's the sort of thing we should all recognize is incompatible with political leadership, incompatible with an oath to uphold the Constitution and to faithfully execute the laws of the United States. And hopefully that is a lesson that people will draw from recent events.
Thank you. I want to take this opportunity to thank our viewers for your questions today. I also want to thank Professors Beckwith and Adler for their tremendous insights into this matter. And we appreciate that you are both here today and put time into this. Thank you so much. To our viewers, thank you for joining us today. And again, for those really excellent questions that you provided to us. We really appreciate your participation. And should you have any additional questions or comments on today's subject matter, please pass them on to the Alumni Association, and an email address will be displayed on the screen momentarily. I want to thank you again for being here. This is one of our most popular sessions to date, and I appreciate your time today. Have a great week. Thank you.